Have you ever felt like there are two different people living inside your head? One of them wakes up in the morning, full of ambition. This is the person who sets the alarm for 5 a.m., who buys the healthy groceries, who promises to finally start that creative project, to have that difficult conversation, to be the person they know deep down they are capable of being. And then there's the other person. This is the one who actually hits the snooze button 5 times, who orders takeout after the fresh vegetables have wilted in the fridge, who finds themselves scrolling endlessly on their phone, the silence of the room amplifying the quiet hum of a dream deferred for yet another day. Why does this happen? Why is the gap between our intentions and our actions a canyon so wide it can sometimes feel impossible to cross? This isn't a simple question of discipline or willpower. It's a deep, frustratingly human paradox that lives at the core of our experience. We are the authors of our own lives, yet we so often feel like we're just reading from a script written by a stranger. We meticulously plan our days, our careers, our futures, but the moment-to-moment reality is often dictated by impulses, anxieties, and habits that seem to have a mind of their own. We feel like we are at war with ourselves, and it is an exhausting, silent, and deeply lonely battle. This profound and universal struggle is the very question that came to obsess a woman named Ava Thompson. But Ava wasn't a psychologist or a neuroscientist, not at first. She was an architect, a master of structure and design, a person who spent her life creating blueprints for magnificent, functional, and beautiful physical spaces. She became consumed by the question of our inner chaos precisely because her outer world was a monument to order and control, and she discovered that the principles used to build a skyscraper might hold the key to reconstructing the very foundation of the human mind. This is the story of her journey, a quest to find a blueprint not for a building of steel and glass, but for a mind of peace and purpose. It is a story about becoming the architect of your own internal world. Before Ava Thompson became a cartographer of the mind, she was celebrated for her mastery over the physical world. Her firm was renowned for designing buildings that weren't just structures, but experiences. She understood how a corridor could encourage collaboration, how a window could frame a view to inspire calm, how the very bones of a building could shape the behavior and emotions of the people within it. Her desk was a landscape of perfect order. Pencils sharpened to a fine point, blueprints rolled with precision, complex calculations resolved to the neatest decimal. She could orchestrate the symphony of 100 contractors, manage multi-million-dollar budgets, and predict the stresses on a steel beam a decade into the future. By every external metric, she was a staggering success. But inside, her world was a ruin. The serene, minimalist aesthetic she was famous for creating for others was a universe away from the tangled, overgrown chaos of her own thoughts. She would stand at a gala, accepting an award for a building that would be celebrated for generations, and the only sound she could hear was a screaming internal monologue of inadequacy, a relentless inner critic that told her she was a fraud, and that this success was a fluke that would soon be exposed. She would design workspaces that fostered productivity and flow, yet she would return to her own pristine apartment and find herself utterly paralyzed, unable to answer a simple email from her sister or pay a bill that had been sitting on her counter for weeks. The architect who could design a blueprint for a city block couldn't design a peaceful Saturday morning for herself. Her life was a study in profound contradiction. The immense cognitive power she used to shape concrete and steel was utterly useless against her own chronic anxiety. The discipline that drove her professional life evaporated when it came to her personal well-being. She felt like a ghost haunting the beautiful life she had built. The crisis arrived not with a bang, but with a quiet, hollow echo. It was after the unveiling of her magnum opus, a breathtakingly innovative library that seemed to float over a city park. The project had consumed her for 5 years. It was her masterpiece. And as she stood on the polished marble floor, watching the first visitors walk in with expressions of wonder, she felt absolutely nothing. The void inside her was so vast and so cold that the architectural triumph surrounding her felt like a cage. It was in that moment of profound emptiness that the question shifted. It was no longer a passive curiosity. It was a desperate, urgent need for survival. How could she be the architect of a world-class library, yet be a prisoner in the collapsing structure of her own mind? She realized she had spent her entire life mastering the principles of external design while completely ignoring the architecture of her internal world. And so, she began a new project, the most complex and ambitious of her life. She stepped away from her firm, trading her drafting table for a desk pile high with books on neuroscience, psychology, and ancient philosophy. She would apply the rigorous, systematic, and compassionate principles of an architect to the one structure she had never dared to examine: herself. Her first major breakthrough came not from a textbook, but from the slow, painstaking process of deconstructing her own thought patterns. She initially approached her mind like a flawed building, looking for a single structural weakness, a foundational crack that she could patch up. She tried meditation, affirmations, strict scheduling, all the conventional tools. They were like applying a new coat of paint to a house with a crumbling foundation. They addressed the surface, but the deep, internal tremors continued. The problem, she began to suspect, was more fundamental. She was treating her mind as a single entity, a unified I that was simply malfunctioning. She was trying to force this I to be more disciplined, more focused, more calm. But the more she tried to impose a singular will, the more internal resistance she met. The real insight began to dawn on her when she stumbled upon research into the modular nature of the brain, the idea that our consciousness isn't a single CO sitting in a command center, but more like a bustling, chaotic committee. This resonated with her own experience. The part of her that wanted to work and the part that wanted to rest weren't just different moods. They felt like different beings with entirely different agendas. This led her to her first foundational principle. The mind is not a monolith. It is a parliament. We are not a single I. We are a collection of competing internal voices, each with its own beliefs, fears, and desires. And the mistake we make is trying to silence them to elect a dictator, when we should be acting as a mediator. The power of this idea truly crystallized when she began working with others, applying her nascent theories. She met a man named David, a brilliant musician who was crippled by stage fright. For years, he'd been told to be more confident, to push through the fear. He had tried to crush the anxious part of himself, to lock it away. But the fear always came back, stronger than before. Ava didn't tell him to fight it. Instead, she asked him to give it a name and a seat at the table. He called it the protector. Ava guided him through a kind of internal negotiation. What was the protector afraid of? Humiliation. Failure. What did it want? To keep him safe. It wasn't a villain trying to sabotage his career. It was an overzealous security guard, trying to protect him from perceived threats. Then she asked him to identify the other voices. There was the artist, the part of him that lived and breathed music, that craved the connection with an audience. There was the disciplinarian, the part that had practiced for thousands of hours and knew he was technically flawless. For the first time, David stopped seeing his mind as me versus my anxiety. He saw it as a negotiation between protector, the artist, and the disciplinarian. He learned to speak to protector, to acknowledge its fear and reassure it. He could say, I hear you. I know you're trying to keep me safe. But the disciplinarian has done the work, and the artist needs to express himself. We can do this safely. The goal wasn't to eliminate the fear, but to integrate it. The protector was given a new job, not to stop him from going on stage, but to ensure he was prepared, to be a quiet observer in the wings instead of screaming heckler at the front of his mind. This was a seismic shift. It meant that anxiety, procrastination, and self-doubt weren't enemies to be vanquished. They were messages from legitimate parts of ourselves that had been ignored, misunderstood, or suppressed. The procrastinator inside you isn't lazy. It might be a part of you that's terrified of failure, or a part that is genuinely exhausted and crying out for rest. The inner critic isn't just cruel. It might be a distorted, terrified version of a part that desperately wants you to be accepted and to avoid social rejection. The first step of a mind architect, Ava realized, wasn't to draw up a new plan. It was to conduct a survey of the current inhabitants, to listen to their stories, and to understand the ecosystem that was already there. You don't silence the parliament. You learn to chair the meeting. For a time, this framework of the mental parliament seemed like the complete answer. Ava saw incredible transformations in the people she worked with and in herself. By identifying and mediating their inner voices, people were able to untangle knots of procrastination and anxiety that had plagued them for decades. The internal battlefield was slowly turning into a negotiating table. But as she went deeper, she discovered a complication, a more stubborn layer to the problem. Sometimes, the Parliament would descend into chaos. A single, powerful voice would seize control, override all the others, and lead to devastating acts of self-sabotage. The progress made through careful mediation could be undone in a single afternoon. She saw this clearly in the case of a woman named Maria, a successful lawyer who wanted to leave her high-stress corporate job to become a teacher. She had done the work. She identified the achiever, the voice that loved the prestige and salary of her law career. She listened to the nurturer, the part of her that felt a deep calling to work with children. She even made peace with the security seeker, the voice terrified of financial instability. They had reached a compromise. She would save for a year, get her teaching credentials at night, and make a gradual, sensible transition. It was a perfect plan. And yet, every time she got close to a real milestone, like paying off a major debt or acing an education exam, she would inexplicably sabotage it. She'd go on a reckless spending spree or miss a crucial application deadline. It was as if a hidden force was determined to keep her trapped. The parliamentary model couldn't fully explain this. Why would the entire system conspire to defeat its own negotiated settlement? This puzzle pushed Ava beyond cognitive models and into the realm of narrative psychology. She began to understand that while the voices were the actors on the stage, something else was writing the play. This led her to her second and more profound discovery. Every mental parliament is governed by a single, overarching story she called the keystone narrative. This is a core, often unconscious, belief about yourself in a world that acts as the constitution for your entire inner state. It dictates which voices get the most airtime, which fears are treated as legitimate, and which desires are deemed impossible. The keystone narrative is the invisible architecture that holds all the other pieces in place. With Maria, Ava stopped focusing on the individual voices and started digging for the underlying story. After weeks of conversation, they unearthed it. It was a simple, powerful narrative that had been formed in her childhood. My worth comes from being a responsible one. She had been the eldest child of immigrant parents, and from a young age, her identity was forged in being reliable, successful, and financially secure. She was praised for her achievements, not her passions. Her keystone narrative wasn't just a belief. It was a source of her value, her safety, her very identity. Suddenly, her self-sabotage made perfect sense. Leaving a prestigious law career to become a teacher, while consciously desired, was a direct threat to this core narrative. It was an act of irresponsibility in the eyes of that story. So, her entire mental system, marshaled by this powerful, hidden narrative, would rise up to protect the integrity of the story. Her spending, sprees and missed deadlines weren't random acts of chaos. They were desperate, albeit destructive, attempts to reinforce her old identity as a high-earning, responsible lawyer. The discovery was staggering. It meant that you could spend years mediating your inner voices. But if you don't excavate and rewrite the keystone narrative, you are merely rearranging furniture in a house that's built on a slant. The true work of mind architect wasn't just managing the inhabitants. It was about examining and, if necessary, redesigning the very blueprint of the entire structure. The second principle was deeper, more difficult, and infinitely more powerful. It meant we had to become archaeologists of our own pasts, detectives looking for the origin story that was secretly running our lives. And it meant that true, lasting change required the courage to let an old story die. This was the moment when everything clicked into place. The two great principles Ava had uncovered, the Parliament of Voices and the Keystone Narrative, were not separate ideas. They were two parts of a single, elegant, and dynamic system. One could not be fully understood or utilized without the other. This was the grand synthesis, the unifying theory she had been searching for since that hollow moment in her award-winning library. Her mind went back to her first love, architecture. She realized the metaphor was perfect. When you design a building, you don't just start throwing up walls and installing windows. You begin with a blueprint. That blueprint is the soul of the structure. It defines the building's purpose. Is it a home meant for comfort and family? Is it a museum meant for quiet contemplation? Is an office meant for productivity? This core purpose, this story of the building, is the keystone narrative. It dictates every subsequent decision. The layout of rooms, the flow of traffic, the materials used, the way it interacts with light and landscape, the parliament of voices, then are the individual rooms and systems within that building. The kitchen has a different purpose than the bedroom. The electrical system has a different function from the plumbing. They are all distinct voices within the larger structure. You can have a state-of-the-art kitchen, a highly developed achiever voice, and a beautifully serene bedroom, a well-tended, restful voice. But if the overall blueprint, the keystone narrative, is for a prison, then no matter how nice the individual rooms are, the experience of living there will be one of confinement. This was the ultimate aha moment. The reason so many of us feel stuck is that we are trying to renovate the rooms without ever looking at the blueprint. We try to force our procrastinator voice to be a productivity voice, which is like trying to turn a bedroom into a kitchen without changing any of the plumbing or wiring. It won't work. The true work, the work of mind architect, is to first unroll the old, dusty blueprints of your mind and examine the core story you've been living in. Then, with conscious intention, you must begin the process of drawing a new one. The grand, unifying idea was this: we are not victims of our thoughts, nor are we soldiers at war with our impulses. We are designers. Our primary, most sacred task is to consciously and deliberately design a keystone narrative for our lives, a story that is expansive, compassionate, and aligned with our deepest values. Once that new blueprint is in place, the work of mediating the parliament of voices becomes transformed. It's no longer about refereeing an endless civil war. Instead, it becomes about aligning all the different parts of you, all your incredible inner voices, to the task of building the beautiful, functional structure defined by your new story. The goal is not to achieve a silent, empty mind. The goal is to build an inner cathedral, a place where the voice of your inner critic can be transformed into a voice of discerning wisdom, where your fear can become a source of prudent caution, and where all the disparate parts of you can work in harmony, because they are all, finally, building the same thing. So where does this journey leave us, standing here in the complex, often chaotic architecture of our own lives? Ava Thompson's story began with a universal question about the frustrating gap between who we want to be and who we find ourselves being. Her journey, from an architect of buildings to an architect of the mind, offers us not a simple answer, but a powerful blueprint. It shows us that the path to inner coherence isn't through force, but through design. It begins with the courage to stop fighting and start listening, to become an archaeologist of your own mind, mapping the various voices that make up your inner parliament without judgment. Who are they? What do they fear? What do they truly want? The second step is to become a detective, to search for the recurring patterns in your life, the self-sabotaging behaviors and the persistent anxieties, and use them as clues to uncover the keystone narrative, the hidden story that has been running the show. And finally, the most crucial step, to become the architect, to consciously choose and begin writing a new, more empowering story for yourself, a story that is big enough to hold all the parts of you, a blueprint for a life of purpose and integration. This is not easy work. It is perhaps the most challenging and rewarding work a human being can undertake. It requires honesty, courage, and a deep compassion for yourself. The alternative, however, is to continue living as a tenant in a house you didn't build, following rules you didn't write, forever trapped by the limitations of an old and outdated blueprint. But understanding this is only the first draft. The real change happens when you pick up the tools and begin the work. And you don't have to do it alone. By subscribing to this channel, you're not just clicking a button. You're joining a community of fellow architects, people who are committed to the brave work of designing a more intentional life from the inside out. You're making a declaration that you are ready to be the author, the designer, and the builder of your own experience. The blueprints are in your hands. It's time to start building.